June 10, 1944, near Vitebsk, Belarus. I remember the first Soviet barrages like poorly aimed fireworks. They bloomed far off, scattered flashes on the horizon, explosions that shook nothing but our laughter. "The Ivans can't hit a barn door," our sergeant used to say, his voice echoing in the timber walls of our dugout. And we laughed with him, every time. We thought their artillery was clumsy, their tactics primitive, their soldiers expendable. Back then, I still believed that our Reich was unshakable, that we were the future, and they were the dying past. We had grown used to arrogance. The front was quiet most days, broken only by distant gunfire or the occasional Soviet probe that our machine guns swatted down with ease. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I remember thinking that even war could feel safe if you survived long enough. We drank from tin cups, joked about the Russians' poor aim, and drew crude maps in the dirt, pretending we understood the scale of what was coming. None of us did. Our battery sat on a ridge overlooking a wide field pockmarked by shell craters. The grass had long since turned to mud from spring rain and tank tracks. Each morning, we cleaned the barrels, checked the sights, and waited for orders that rarely came. The officers told us that the Red Army was exhausted, broken by our victories in 1943. We were told that the worst was behind us, that the Russians could never mount another large offensive. The maps in the command post seemed to agree. Red lines stopped far to the east. Blue ones, ours, held steady. We believed in those lines as if they were iron walls. Sometimes, at dusk, I would hear their voices across no man's land, faint, almost human through the haze. Songs, laughter, the crack of firewood. They didn't sound like monsters or faceless enemies then. But we couldn't afford to think of them as men. The regime had taught us to dehumanize, to simplify. "They're cattle," the sergeant said once, pouring schnapps into his tin cup. "They fight with numbers, not with brains." And I nodded, because disagreeing felt dangerous, even to myself. Then came the first proper barrage, still far, still inaccurate, but angrier somehow. The ground quivered, and a strange unease crawled through our laughter. One shell landed closer than usual, showering us with dirt. Someone joked that they were improving. We laughed again, but not as loudly. Something was changing in the air. The distant thunder of guns had a rhythm now, not random, but deliberate. Patterns emerged in their chaos. It was as if the Red Army had been listening, learning, and waiting for the moment to strike back. That night, as I lay in the bunker staring at the flickering lantern, I wondered for the first time if our overconfidence was just another weapon aimed at us, a poison fed from above. I thought of the propaganda posters, of the speeches about destiny and superiority. All lies, perhaps. But it was easier to believe in lies than to face the truth that we might not be as strong as we thought. By morning, the mist rolled in thick and heavy. I could barely see the field below. The world smelled of rain and smoke. Somewhere in the fog, a single Soviet shell landed with deadly precision, straight into the neighboring battery. The blast threw mud and bodies skyward. The laughter stopped for good that day. And as I looked out over the cratered field, the echo of that explosion still ringing in my ears, I realized something I would never forget. Arrogance is the last refuge before ruin. June 22, 1944, the night the sky split open. It began with a vibration, faint at first, like the tremor of a distant storm. I woke in the dugout, thinking it was thunder. But then the earth shook again, harder this time, and the sound grew into a roar that seemed to come from every direction. When I crawled out into the damp night air, the horizon was already glowing red. The sky wasn't just lit, it was breaking apart. The Russian artillery had found its mark. The first shells landed close enough to rattle my teeth. The next ones tore open the ridge. The entire line erupted in light and fury. Our guns, once symbols of pride, were now deafened by an orchestra of Soviet steel. Every second brought a new explosion, each one closer than the last. The noise was beyond human comprehension, a constant rolling wall of sound that crushed thought itself. I could no longer tell where the ground ended and the air began. Everything was fire, dust, and screaming. The smell of wet earth mixed with cordite and blood. I remember stumbling toward the gun pit, half blind, as sparks and shrapnel sliced through the night. My hands shook as I tried to cover my ears, but it didn't matter, the sound penetrated bone. The barrage never paused, not for a breath, not for mercy. It was as if the entire Soviet front had opened up on us at once. Later, I learned that it was true. The Red Army's Operation Bagration had begun. Beside me, young Weber, the quiet one from Munich, was shouting something I couldn't hear. His mouth moved, eyes wide with terror, until a flash consumed him. When the smoke cleared, only his helmet remained, lying upside down in the mud. I stared at it for what felt like hours, even as shells kept falling. I wanted to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The human mind wasn't built to witness the end of the world, and that's exactly what it looked like that night. The ground heaved beneath us. Trees snapped like twigs. Our ammunition dump went up in a single colossal blast, throwing burning fragments high into the air. They fell back down in slow arcs, like a rain of fire. The irony struck me even then. We had once laughed at their aim, and now every shell landed with surgical precision. Someone yelled for medics. Another screamed that the Russians were advancing. No one could tell if it was true. We could barely see through the smoke. I found cover behind a collapsed wall and pressed my face into the dirt. My eardrums felt ready to burst. Somewhere nearby, a man was crying out for his mother, voice cracked and desperate. I turned toward the sound and saw him crawling through the mud, one leg gone below the knee. His blood soaked the ground, mixing with the rainwater until the whole trench seemed to flow red. He wasn't the only one. The line between soldier and victim had vanished entirely. And still the barrage went on. Minutes turned to hours. We stopped counting. Shells landed in a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, as if a machine, not men, had taken revenge upon us. By dawn, our position was unrecognizable. The forest had turned to splinters, the bunkers to open graves. When silence finally came, it felt unreal, a hollow, ringing quiet that carried the weight of what we had lost. The sergeant's voice was gone. Half the battery was gone. Even the air seemed poisoned, heavy with burnt powder and despair. I stood there among the wreckage, looking east toward the rising sun, and for the first time, I felt afraid not of dying, but of living long enough to see what came next. That night, when the sky split open, the war changed forever. And so did I. June 24, 1944, the order from Hitler, no step back. 2 days after the sky tore itself apart, the radio crackled through the static with a voice from another world, Berlin. The message came in clipped German, each word deliberate and final, no step back. Hold the line. Fight to the last man. The lieutenant repeated it aloud to the battery, his face pale beneath a crust of soot. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Everyone knew what the order meant. We were already finished, and now we were forbidden to admit it. The men stood in silence, rain dripping from the ruins of our dugout roofs. The ground still trembled with distant impacts, the last notes of the Soviet artillery symphony fading into the horizon. Our telephones to neighboring units had gone dead, our maps useless. The front line had dissolved, not shifted, but vanished. Yet Berlin wanted us to believe we still held a position. The illusion of control was more important to them than our survival. I looked around and saw what was left of our battery, a handful of men, faces blackened by smoke, uniforms shredded, hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. We were ghosts pretending to be soldiers. One of them, Kruger, spat into the mud and muttered, "The Führer should come hold it himself." Nobody answered, but several men looked away, terrified that someone might report him. Even in the ruins, fear of the regime still ruled us more than fear of death. Orders arrived from the regimental command to prepare for another barrage, as if we still had the ammunition, as if we still had targets. I checked our crates. Half were empty, the rest contained shells warped from the previous night's heat. Still, we obeyed. We lined up the guns, adjusted the elevation, and fired into a fog so thick we couldn't even see where the shells landed. The earth shook, but it felt meaningless, like throwing stones into the sea. Then came the reports. Soviet tanks had broken through near Orsha and were pushing west in unstoppable waves. Entire divisions were collapsing. Some of our own units were being cut off from retreat. Yet the radio kept repeating the same order: hold your ground. No retreat. No surrender. I began to realize that this wasn't a command for soldiers. It was a sentence. At dusk, I went to the edge of the forest where our lookout post used to be. From there, I could see the plain stretching for miles, black smoke pillars twisting into the sky, fire spreading through the ruins of what had once been our forward positions. Somewhere beyond that, the Red Army was moving like a tide, invisible yet unstoppable. I heard their engines, deep, rhythmic, like thunder rolling through the soil. I thought of home then, of my father's voice when he told me to serve, for honor, for the Reich. Of the parades in '39. The songs, the promises. How hollow they sounded now, buried under the noise of a war we could no longer win. Honor. We were being ordered to die so that men in distant offices could preserve their pride. When night fell, the lieutenant gathered us again. He stood by the last working field gun, his uniform torn, his cap gone. "We have our orders," he said quietly. "We stay." He didn't try to sound brave. Perhaps he knew that courage had no meaning here. The wind carried the faint echo of explosions from the east, the sound of another German position dying. The men began to dig shallow foxholes, though everyone knew it wouldn't matter. The Red Army was coming. The ground was already shaking beneath their weight. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant rumble and thought of one simple truth. The enemy wasn't just out there, beyond the forest. He was also behind us, in the voice on the radio, in the commands from Berlin, in the blind obedience that chained us to a war already lost. By morning, I knew what "no step back" truly meant. It wasn't defiance. It was denial. June 26, 1944, shooting our own. The line was gone. Not broken, gone. The forest that had once hidden our positions was now a wasteland of splintered trees and smoking craters. The maps our officers clung to were nothing but lies drawn on paper. Units had scattered in every direction, some fighting without orders, others simply running. We had lost contact with the flanks, and by dawn it was impossible to tell who was enemy and who was friend. The air smelled of smoke, wet grass, and decay. We fired when commanded, though none of us truly knew where the shells were landing. Our communications were patchy, our coordinates improvised. "Sector 3 needs covering fire," came the voice through the static. "Immediate barrage." So we obeyed, set the angles, lit the fuses, and let the guns roar. When the wind shifted, we heard the screams. Not in Russian, in German. At first, I thought it was an echo, a trick of distance. But then the voices became clear. "Cease fire! Cease fire! You're hitting us!" We froze. The lieutenant snatched the receiver, shouting for confirmation, but there was only silence. Then another shell hit, one of ours, and the ground erupted in the distance where our comrades had been retreating. The realization hit harder than any explosion. We were killing our own. I felt my stomach turn cold. The sergeant swore under his breath and slammed his fist against the gun shield. "They sent us the wrong coordinates," he said, but even he didn't believe it. We had been so desperate to fight back that we hadn't cared what we were aiming at. The chaos had consumed every sense of direction. We had become blind executioners of our own army. Later, as the smoke thinned, I walked toward the ridge to see what we had done. The field below was littered with wrecked trucks and the twisted shapes of men still burning where they fell. Their gray uniforms looked just like ours. One of them was waving weakly, his arm raised toward us in a final pitiful gesture. Then he stopped moving. I wanted to run down and help him, but the lieutenant's voice stopped me. "Stay at your post." "That's an order." So I stayed. That night, the survivors from those units staggered back toward our lines. Their faces were covered in soot and mud, eyes wide and empty. One of them, barely older than a boy, shouted at us as he passed, "You fired on us! You damned idiots! You killed your own!" No one answered. There was nothing to say. As darkness fell, the battery sat in silence. The men smoked without speaking, staring into the flames of a ruined farmhouse nearby. The light flickered over their faces, turning each into a hollow mask. I kept hearing the cries of the men we'd shelled, over and over, as if the air itself still carried them. For the first time, I began to hate the very sound of our guns. They had once been the proud thunder of our army's strength. Now they were instruments of confusion and betrayal. Before sleeping, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line, "We are firing at ghosts, and some of them speak German." That night, I couldn't tell who the real enemy was anymore. June 28, 1944, the execution in the trench. By the fourth day of Bagration, discipline was breaking faster than the front. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear were now our officers. Men drifted away in the fog, pretending to scout or carry messages that no one had sent. Every hour, the sound of Russian artillery drew closer, echoing like the footsteps of something inevitable. We all felt it. The collapse was no longer a possibility, it was already happening around us. That morning, a young private tried to run. His name was Ernst. 17, maybe 18. He had joined us barely a month earlier, a boy who still carried a photograph of his mother tucked into his tunic. I remember him because he was always smiling, even when the shells fell. But the smile was gone now. When the barrage began again, Ernst panicked and bolted toward the treeline, throwing his rifle aside. Someone shouted his name, but he didn't stop. 2 military policemen caught him before he reached the wire. They dragged him back through the mud while the rest of us watched in silence. No one dared to intervene. We knew what would come next. We had seen it before, but never so close, never so personal. The lieutenant gathered the remaining men by the edge of a trench. His voice was calm, almost too calm, when he spoke. The Führer's order is clear. Desertion in the face of the enemy is treason. He will be executed. The boy begged. He said he'd only meant to look for cover, that he was disoriented. His words tumbled out in a torrent of tears. But the lieutenant didn't listen. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he had convinced himself that obedience was the only thing separating us from chaos, though chaos had already swallowed everything. They stood him at the edge of the trench, facing east, where the smoke from the Russian advance clouded the horizon. His hands trembled. Someone handed him a blindfold, but he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I want to see." The lieutenant gave the order. 5 rifles cracked as one. Ernst's body jerked backward, knees folding before he collapsed into the muddy pit. The echo of the shots faded quickly, swallowed by the distant thunder of Soviet guns. And then there was silence. No one moved for a long time. The air hung heavy with the smell of gunpowder and wet soil. I stared at the spot where he had fallen, my stomach twisted into knots. Around me, the men avoided each other's eyes. The sergeant finally muttered, "Back to your posts," and we obeyed, because that's what soldiers do, even when the soul rebels. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Ernst's face, not in death, but in life. The boy who once joked that he'd never even been kissed. The boy who had believed he was fighting for something noble. The boy we had killed to prove our loyalty to a regime that was already dying. I realized then that we were no longer fighting the Russians. We were fighting our own fear, our own orders, our own guilt. And in that battle, there would be no victory. July 1st, 1944, the road to Mogilev. When the order to retreat finally came, it no longer meant salvation. It meant we were already too late. Mogilev lay somewhere to the west, a name on a map that promised safety, though none of us believed it. The road leading there was no longer a road at all, but a graveyard stretched across the earth. Burned-out trucks, overturned carts, shattered bicycles, and bodies, too many bodies, lined the muddy path. We moved in silence, a procession of the defeated. The horses stumbled over shell fragments and half-buried corpses. Some still wore our gray uniforms, others, tattered civilian coats. Among them were women and children, Belarusians fleeing the same firestorm that chased us. They didn't look at us as allies or enemies anymore. Just other desperate creatures trying to survive the collapse of the world. The air reeked of oil, smoke, and death. Every few minutes, another column of black smoke rose in the distance where Soviet planes had found targets. Their engines droned overhead, invisible in the clouds, and every man instinctively ducked as if that could save him. When a truck exploded ahead of us, scattering men and metal into the ditch, no one screamed or ran. We simply walked around the wreckage. Shock had dulled everything inside us. I saw a little girl on the roadside, no older than 6, clutching a doll that was missing an arm. Her mother pulled her close as we passed, eyes hollow, lips trembling. The child stared at my uniform, not with fear, but with confusion. Perhaps she wondered which side we were on. I no longer knew myself. By afternoon, the column stretched for miles. Wounded soldiers limped beside horse carts carrying the dying. Some had bandages soaked through with blood, others stared blankly ahead, moving only because the mass behind them pushed forward. The cries of "Sonny! Medic!" were answered by silence. There were no medics left. We passed through villages that no longer had names, just piles of ashes and chimneys standing like gravestones. Dogs wandered among the ruins, barking at nothing. I couldn't tell whether the destruction had been caused by our own retreat or by the Soviet advance. It didn't matter. Everything was burning: houses, barns, memories. That night, we halted near a bend in the road where a bridge had been blown apart. The engineers said they would rebuild it by morning, but everyone knew the Russians would reach us before then. I sat by the remains of a farmhouse, watching the sky flicker red on the horizon. The sound of artillery was constant now, a heartbeat of doom that never faded. I thought of the execution 2 days earlier, of Ernst falling into the trench. What was the point of his death, if we were retreating anyway? What was the point of any of it? When darkness fell, I saw civilians lighting candles in the ruins, tiny points of light in a sea of shadow. For a moment, I envied them. They still believed light meant hope. For us, it only meant we could be seen. By dawn, the road to Mogilev was crowded again. Engines sputtered, boots splashed through the mud, and the smell of smoke grew stronger with every step. Somewhere behind us, the Soviet guns were still singing their terrible song. And we kept marching, not toward safety, but toward the next disaster waiting for us down the road. July 3, 1944, between burned farms and torn flags. We left the broken road behind and entered a landscape that no longer felt real. The villages we passed were nothing but blackened shells, their roofs caved in, their wells filled with ashes. The air carried a thick, acrid smoke that clung to the throat and made every breath feel like swallowing dust. Even the trees seemed to have burned from the inside, their trunks hollow and steaming, as if the fire itself refused to die. Our boots sank into soft mud laced with fragments of glass and bone. Every few hundred meters we found a barn still smoldering or a house reduced to a single wall, standing like a monument to something no one would ever rebuild. The silence was heavy. No birds, no barking dogs, no voices. Only the crunch of boots and the occasional clatter of equipment as we trudged westward, slower with each step. Then we saw them, villagers who had survived. A handful of old men and children, watching us from behind fences of twisted wire. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sharp with hatred and fear. A woman held a bundle in her arms, though I could not tell if it was a baby or just cloth wrapped around her memories. Some spat as we passed. Others simply turned away. I couldn't blame them. We had brought this ruin here, even if we were now victims of the same destruction. One farmhouse still had a flagpole. A tattered red and white cloth hung from it, half-burned and unrecognizable. I stopped to stare at it, not knowing whether it had once flown a swastika or a Soviet star. Either way, it no longer mattered. Both symbols had turned this land into ashes. We marched on through what must once have been fields. Now they were wastelands of black earth scattered with shell fragments. Someone muttered that we were walking through the remains of a partisan village, one our units had cleared months earlier. The word, cleared, echoed in my head like a curse. I remembered the briefings, the cold, bureaucratic language of command, pacification, retaliation, security measures. Euphemisms for horror. A few kilometers later, we found the ruins of a church. Its steeple had collapsed, the cross buried in rubble. Inside, I saw scorched icons and the remains of pews where villagers must have prayed for deliverance. I wondered what side they had prayed for, ours, the Soviets, or simply for an end to both. That night, we made camp near what used to be a farm. The fields around us still glowed faintly, embers pulsing under the night breeze. As I sat by a dying fire, I could hear distant explosions. Mogilev, perhaps. The horizon flickered orange, and I felt certain that every light in that direction marked another life being erased. One of the men, Mahler, whispered that he had seen children earlier, dead, their small bodies laid out beside the road. He didn't say whose bullets had killed them. None of us asked. The truth no longer mattered. The guilt belonged to everyone. I looked up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind smoke. And I realized that on this front, there were no flags left to fight for, only ashes, silence, and the ghosts of those who had believed in them. July 5, 1944, Bobruisk, the quagmire. By the time we reached the outskirts of Bobruisk, the land itself seemed to resist us. The roads had turned into rivers of mud, thick as tar, swallowing boots and wheels alike. The rain had not stopped for days, and every drop that fell seemed to carry the weight of the entire front collapsing. The sky was a dull gray curtain, the air heavy with smoke and rot. Somewhere beyond that haze, the Red Army was closing in, their artillery already within range. We had been promised reinforcements. Instead, we found chaos. Columns of broken men stumbled out of the town. Infantry, clerks, cooks, all mixed together, faces hollow and uniforms caked with filth. They spoke in fragments, half delirious, encircled, tanks everywhere, no way out. Some still clutched their rifles, others nothing at all. They moved past us without looking back, as though we were already dead. When we entered Bobruisk, it no longer resembled a city. The streets were seas of mud and debris, the air filled with the sharp stench of gasoline and decay. Houses leaned at impossible angles, their roofs torn off by shellfire. Fires burned unchecked, their light reflecting in the pools of water that covered the ground. Somewhere nearby a cow bellowed, trapped under fallen beams. Its cries blended with those of the wounded. Our unit tried to set up the guns near the river, but it was pointless. The wheels sank deep into the sludge, and every attempt to dig in was erased by the next bombardment. The ground shook continuously, as if the world itself were trying to throw us off. We had become static targets, prey waiting for the next strike. At one point, I ran to find water for the wounded and stumbled upon what used to be a hospital cellar. Inside, it was dark except for a few lanterns flickering in the damp air. The place was filled with bodies, some breathing, most not. Nurses moved among them silently, their faces gray, their eyes beyond tears. I tried to hand one a canteen, but she just stared at me and whispered, "Too late for water." Outside, the screams of engines grew louder, Soviet tanks. Their sound was unmistakable, the heavy clatter of tracks grinding through the mud. Panic spread like fire through our ranks. Someone shouted that the Russians had already crossed the bridge, others that we were surrounded. In truth, no one knew. The city had dissolved into a nightmare where direction, command, and reason no longer existed. I saw men firing blindly into the fog, at shadows, at ghosts. The air smelled of cordite and oil. Then, through the smoke, I caught sight of one of our banners lying half buried in the muck, the black cross barely visible beneath a layer of mud and blood. I thought about picking it up, but something stopped me. That flag no longer meant anything. By nightfall, the shelling intensified again. Buildings collapsed one by one, each with a groan like a dying giant. The mud had turned to crimson slurry beneath our boots. When the order to withdraw came, it was meaningless. There was nowhere left to go. Bobruisk wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a graveyard swallowing everything: men, machines, faith, and the last illusion that the Reich could still stand. July 7th, 1944, the voice of the Commissar. The fog came first, thick, cold, and silent. It rolled through the ruins of Bobruisk like a living thing, smothering sound and color until the world became nothing but gray. We crouched in the wreckage of a schoolhouse, rifles resting on the windowsills, staring into that haze where the enemy moved unseen. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, almost suffocating. Then, through that suffocating quiet, a voice began to echo. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind. But soon it became clear, it was coming from loudspeakers hidden somewhere beyond the mist. The words were Russian, spoken slowly, clearly, as if meant for us. A translation followed in broken German: "German soldiers, your commanders have abandoned you. Lay down your arms. You will be treated with mercy." Some of the men laughed bitterly, others turned away. Mercy. We all knew what Soviet mercy meant: the NKVD, the camps, the disappearances. But the voice didn't stop. It kept repeating, calm and almost soothing, as if it belonged to a teacher or a priest. "The Führer cannot save you. Hitler lies. Your death here will not change his fate." Each word sank deeper than any bullet. I tried to ignore it, but something inside me began to unravel. It wasn't just propaganda, it was truth wrapped in the tone of compassion. I looked around the room. Faces once carved from steel now looked hollow, pale. The sergeant's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. He muttered, They know we're finished. They can smell it. A few hours later, the shelling resumed, tearing through the fog. Our building shuddered, the ceiling cracking above our heads. Dust rained down, mixing with sweat and smoke. Between barrages, the voice would return, always calm, always patient, like death waiting politely outside the door. I remembered the stories we'd been told, how Soviet commissars drove their own men into battle at gunpoint, how deserters were shot on the spot. We had laughed at that once, called it madness. Now, I wasn't sure it was any worse than what Berlin demanded from us. Two tyrants, two gods of iron, each feeding on the lives of their believers. When night fell, the loudspeakers went silent. But the silence was worse. Somewhere nearby, the sound of engines and footsteps drifted through the mist, the Soviets closing in. We loaded our rifles, though the act felt more ritual than readiness. I thought of surrender for the first time, not as cowardice but as the only form of sanity left. Then a flare went up, cutting through the darkness. The red light revealed shapes moving at the edge of the street, shadows in long coats, rifles raised. The sergeant shouted for us to fire. The air exploded with gunfire and screams. When it was over, the voice returned one last time, soft and almost kind. The war is already over for you. Stop dying for Hitler. And as I sat there, shaking, my rifle smoking in my hands, I realized I didn't know who I feared more, the men in the mist, or the man whose orders had brought me here. July 9th, 1944, between SS and NKVD. We were no longer soldiers, only survivors drifting through the wreckage of what had once been an army. The front had disintegrated into chaos, and with it vanished every illusion of unity. In one direction, Soviet tanks pushed through the forests like relentless beasts. In the other, SS patrols hunted deserters and defeatists among our own ranks. Between them, men like me tried to disappear, praying to remain unseen by both. We moved west along a forest trail littered with burned trucks and horses. The smell of gasoline and decay clung to everything. The rain had turned the ground into a mirror of filth, reflecting the black smoke that blotted out the sun. At times, we heard distant bursts of gunfire, not battle, but executions. Some said the SS had begun purging officers who'd ordered retreats without permission. Others whispered that the Soviets were shooting prisoners who resisted surrender. None of us needed proof. We had seen enough to believe both. Late that afternoon, we stumbled upon a farmhouse half buried in smoke. Inside, 3 SS men stood over a group of civilians, 2 women, an old man, and a boy no older than 12. The officer's uniform was immaculate despite the mud, his gloves spotless. He accused the villagers of helping partisans. They denied it, their voices shaking. The boy clutched his mother's arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. The officer didn't care. He gave a brief command, and the soldiers raised their weapons. Before I could think, the sergeant beside me grabbed my arm and hissed, "Keep walking." His voice was barely audible. "Don't look." But I looked anyway, just in time to see the officer's pistol flash. The sound echoed through the trees, followed by silence. We marched on, though every step felt heavier. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that single shot, wondering which side I was supposed to hate more. We had been told for years that the Red Army were savages, incapable of mercy. But what mercy had we shown? What had we become? The next morning, Soviet artillery found us again. Shells tore through the forest, shredding branches and men alike. We ran until the ground opened into a field, only to see tanks advancing from the far tree line. Someone shouted, "NKVD troops," and threw down his rifle. A few men followed. Others kept firing, hopelessly. The air filled with gunfire and the whine of ricochets. I hid behind a fallen tree and watched as both sides, SS on one, NKVD on the other, fought with the same ruthless precision. Each believed they were purging evil, cleansing the world of monsters. But from where I crouched, they looked the same, black coats and red stars, both symbols of power without conscience. By dusk, the forest was quiet again. Smoke drifted through the trees, carrying the stench of burning flesh and wet gunpowder. I found a discarded helmet, Soviet, still smeared with mud and blood. I set it down beside an SS cap lying in the grass. 2 emblems, 2 empires, 1 graveyard. In that moment, I understood something I had never dared to admit. Tyranny has no color, no flag, no language. It only wears whatever uniform is available. And in Belarus, that uniform had devoured us all. July 11th, 1944, the last shot of the battery. By the second week of July, our guns were dying one by one. The barrels glowed red, warped from overuse, and our ammunition crates lay empty or buried in mud. The once mighty artillery regiment that had shattered villages across the east was reduced to 3 broken cannons and fewer than 20 men. We had no orders, no maps, no command, only instinct and the dull hope of survival. The sky hung low and gray, filled with the smell of rain and cordite. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Red Army advanced, their shells marking the distance with steady, disciplined rhythm. Each detonation crept closer, like footsteps. We loaded what few shells we had left, 6, maybe 7. Each one felt like a relic from another world. The lieutenant ordered us to fire. His voice cracked, stripped of authority, sounding more like a plea than a command. We adjusted the angles by guesswork, our rangefinders were shattered. When the first shell left the barrel, the recoil nearly threw the gun from its emplacement. The explosion echoed across the valley, swallowed quickly by the roar of Soviet guns answering from the east. We fired again. And again. Each blast shook the ground beneath us, each recoil sending showers of dirt over the dead who still lay unburied nearby. When the final shell was loaded, the lieutenant hesitated. I could see it in his eyes, the awareness that this was not just the end of our battery, but of everything we had once believed in. He nodded. I pulled the lanyard. The cannon roared for the last time. Its echo rolled across the fields like a funeral bell, deep and final. For a moment, there was silence, a silence so profound that even the wind seemed to stop. Then came the distant thud of return fire, and the world erupted once more. The last shell of our battery didn't change anything. It didn't stop the Soviets, didn't save a single man. But to me, it wasn't an attack, it was a farewell. A final act of defiance from men already erased from the war. When the smoke cleared, I sat beside the still barrel, its heat fading beneath my hand. The lieutenant said nothing. No one did. We simply listened to the silence between the shells, and understood that our war had already ended, long before the last shot was ever fired. July 13th, 1944, the encirclement tightens. The forest closed around us like a fist. What was left of our regiment, barely a few dozen men, moved in silence through the trees, each step sinking into wet soil. We had no radio, no contact with higher command. All we knew was rumor, Mogilev had fallen, and the Soviets were sealing the pocket from every direction. The world beyond the trees no longer existed, there was only the ring tightening. By midday, the sound of engines reached us. It wasn't distant anymore, it was everywhere, echoing through the forest like thunder chasing its own tail. Tanks. T-34s. Their tracks cracked branches and churned mud as they moved, unseen but impossibly close. Every instinct screamed to run, yet there was nowhere left to go. We stumbled into a clearing littered with the remains of another unit, burned wagons, a smashed field gun, bodies half buried in mud. Flies swarmed in clouds. Someone whispered a prayer, another cursed Berlin. We were ghosts walking through a graveyard built only days before. When the first shells hit, the forest exploded around us. The ground jumped, trees splintered into spears, and men fell without sound. The sergeant shouted for us to scatter, but the noise drowned his voice. I crawled behind a stump, hands over my head, heart hammering like a drum. Through the smoke, I saw shadows moving, large, mechanical, relentless. The tanks were here. A machine gun opened up somewhere behind me, its tracers vanishing uselessly into the fog. Then came the screams, short, sharp, final. I saw one of our gunners try to fire a Panzerfaust, but the weapon jammed. He never had the chance to try again. When the shooting stopped, the forest was unrecognizable. Trees burned, smoke curled low across the ground, and the air was thick with the stench of oil and blood. Our lieutenant, pale and shaking, dropped his pistol into the mud. "It's over," he whispered. "We're surrounded." Someone raised a rag, white, torn from a bandage. The wind caught it, waving it weakly in the smoke. I felt both shame and relief at the sight. My rifle slipped from my hands, heavy as guilt. As the Soviet shapes emerged from the haze, rifles leveled, I realized that surrender wasn't rescue. It was just another kind of ending. What awaited us now wasn't peace or justice, only retribution, carried by men who'd buried too many of their own to show mercy. And so, the circle closed. July 15, 1944, the column of prisoners. We marched at dawn, though the sun was little more than a pale smear behind the clouds. The rain had turned the road to a river of filth, and each step pulled at our boots as if the earth itself wanted to keep us. Around me stretched an endless line of men, gray coats, hollow faces, eyes fixed on nothing. We were no longer soldiers, only bodies moving because the guards shouted when we stopped. Soviet infantry flanked us on both sides, bayonets glinting under the thin light. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. Their silence was heavier than any command. Now and then, one of them barked an order, and struck a man with his rifle but to quicken the pace. Anyone who stumbled too long was left where he fell. A single shot usually followed. The column stretched for miles, a gray serpent crawling westward. I saw uniforms from every shattered division of Army Group Center, artillerymen, signalers, cooks, even officers stripped of their insignia. Some men still carried helmets, others only the blank stare of those who had seen too much. One limped beside me, murmuring a prayer with every step, his voice a dry rasp swallowed by the mud. Villagers appeared along the roadside, watching us pass. Their faces were unreadable, some curious, some grim. I caught the gaze of an old woman standing by a fence. She spat on the ground and turned away. For a moment, I hated her for it. Then I remembered what we had done to her land. The hate dissolved into shame. At midday, the sun broke through for a brief moment, revealing the full scope of our defeat. The road ahead shimmered with heat and misery, the horizon lined with smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a locomotive wailed. The sound made some men flinch, thinking it artillery. Others whispered that trains meant deportation, east, into the unknown. A man in front of me collapsed without warning. The guard kicked him once, then shot him in the head. The report echoed down the line, and no one spoke. We simply stepped around the body and kept walking. Hours passed. My feet bled inside my boots, my thoughts blurred into exhaustion. The rhythm of marching boots and distant gunfire blended into one endless hum. And as the day faded, I realized that the war hadn't ended for us at all, it had merely changed shape. We were no longer fighting, but we were still prisoners of it. Every step forward was just another surrender. July 18, 1944, the camp behind the front line. They herded us into a field surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. No barracks, no tents, just open ground churned to mud by thousands of boots. The air stank of sweat, sickness, and despair. At night, the temperature dropped, and men huddled together for warmth, whispering in the dark about food, home, or nothing at all. The guards were young, barely older than we were. They shouted orders in Russian, their faces blank, mechanical. Once a day, a wagon arrived with a pot of thin soup, gray water with a few floating grains of barley. We lined up with whatever containers we could find, helmets, tin cups, even our hands. Some men fainted before reaching the front. No one helped them. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, fever, infections from untreated wounds. The dead were carried to a ditch outside the wire, their bodies stiff, their dog tags taken by other prisoners hoping to prove their own death one day. The ditch grew longer each morning. One evening, I met a man who spoke German with a thick accent. He had once fought for the Red Army but was captured by us in 1941. "Now I am traitor to everyone," he said quietly. He told me that when Stalin's forces recaptured Soviet POWs, they were branded as collaborators, often executed or sent to labor camps. "You think you are prisoners," he said. "We all are. Just in different uniforms." His words stayed with me. That night, as rain fell through the barbed wire, I understood what he meant. None of us belonged anywhere anymore. Not to the Reich, not to Russia, not even to ourselves. We were men stripped of names and nations, reduced to hunger, to waiting. And beyond the wire, the guns still thundered, reminding us that war, even in captivity, refused to end. July 21, 1944, the Jew from Minsk. That night, The guards left us alone longer than usual. The rain had stopped, and a thin mist settled over the camp. I sat near the wire, staring at the dim lights of the sentry posts when a voice beside me whispered, "You're from the artillery, aren't you?" He was a thin man, older than most of us, his cheeks hollow but his eyes strangely calm. His name was Isaac. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper that seemed meant only for me. "I'm from Minsk," he said. "Before the war, I taught history." He told me his story in fragments, as if each word cost him strength. When the Germans arrived, they rounded up the Jews, forced them into ghettos, then forests. "They took my wife and my daughters one morning," he said. "There was a clearing near the river. I never saw them again." His voice didn't tremble, it was too empty for that. I didn't know what to say. The camp was silent except for the coughs and moans of the dying. Finally, I managed to ask how he had survived. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "I ran. Hid with partisans. Then they caught me again, your army this time." Shame burned through me like fever. I wanted to tell him I hadn't been there, that I hadn't pulled any triggers. But the words stuck in my throat. We all had served the same machine. Denial didn't change that. Before dawn, Isaac pressed something into my hand, a small scrap of fabric, yellowed and torn, shaped like a star. "Keep it," he said. "Remember what uniforms can make men forget." When the guards came with their rifles, Isaac was gone. I never saw him again. But the star remained, cold, fragile, heavier than anything I had ever carried. July 25, 1944, the confession I never sent. I found the scrap of paper in the corner of a supply crate, damp, wrinkled, and half-torn. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had been silent for too long, and something inside me needed to speak, even if no one would ever read it. That night, under the faint light of the guard tower, I began to write. My hands trembled as I tried to put everything into words: the laughter at the start of the war, the arrogance, the faces of the men we killed, our own and the enemy's. I wrote about Ernst, the boy we executed, and about Isaac, the teacher from Minsk whose family had vanished into the forests we once shelled. Each sentence felt like a confession carved into my own flesh. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I no longer believed in such things. I only wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of my mind before it rotted there. I told my family, if they were even alive, what I had seen, what I had done, and what I had become. I told them that none of it had been glory, only fear wrapped in lies. When I finished, I stared at the words until they blurred. The paper was filthy, stained with mud and tears. I folded it carefully and hid it in my tunic. But as the night deepened, I began to fear what might happen if the guards found it. Just before dawn, I tore it into pieces and buried them in the mud. Yet the words didn't vanish. They stayed with me, echoing in my mind like the endless sound of artillery. I had written a confession no one would ever read, but it didn't matter. The war had already recorded everything, in the earth, in the ruins, and in the silence left by the dead. July 29, 1944, the portrait of Stalin on the wall. They moved us again, farther east, to a makeshift outpost guarded by soldiers who seemed as weary as we were. Inside one of the wooden barracks stood a crude table, a chair, and a single photograph nailed to the wall above it. The face was unmistakable, Joseph Stalin, his mustache sharp, his eyes fixed forward with divine certainty. The guards saluted it as they entered, their movements mechanical, almost religious. I had seen that same expression before, not on faces, but on posters of Hitler back in Germany. The same stern gaze promising strength, demanding faith. Two gods in two uniforms, each worshipped through fear. One evening, a storm rolled in, shaking the barracks with thunder. Through the cracks in the wall, I watched a guard sitting beneath the portrait, polishing his rifle. Every few moments he would glance up at Stalin's face, as if awaiting approval. He couldn't have been more than 19. He might have believed in the promise of the new world he was told he was building. I wondered how long that belief would survive here, among the cold and the corpses. Outside, men coughed and moaned under the rain. Inside, the rifle gleamed beneath the painted eyes of a man who would never know their names. I realized then that this was how tyranny endured, not by force alone, but by faith. It lived in the silence of those who obeyed, and the fear of those who questioned. As lightning flashed, the portrait seemed to glow for a moment, the eyes alive with fire. I turned away, but the image stayed burned into my mind. I had once believed in another face just like it. Now I understood, dictators don't die when empires fall, they survive in the hearts that still need them. August 2nd, 1944, the trial. They called it a tribunal, but it was nothing of the sort. A tent, a table, and 3 officers in Soviet uniforms, that was justice in Bobruisk. We were lined up one by one, each man stepping forward to speak while a translator summarized our words into a few cold sentences. When my turn came, I said the truth. I told them I had been a gunner, that I had followed orders, that I had seen what our army had done. The interpreter frowned, then repeated only, "He admits to firing on Soviet positions." The officer nodded, already writing the verdict. No evidence, no defense, no humanity, only paperwork. For them, we weren't individuals, just statistics to balance against the millions their own side had lost. Around me, some men shouted, others begged, a few simply stood in silence. It made no difference. The sentences were decided before any of us had spoken. When they called the next name, I stepped aside, feeling neither fear nor relief. I had confessed to strangers who didn't care and to gods who never listened. Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft and endless. The war was over for us, but not the reckoning. That would last a lifetime.